And now the introduction by our Guru Maharaj, Jagat Guru Swami Bhakti Gaurava Narasingha Maharaj. Bhagavad Gita is the oldest and most widely read book of theistic science in the world today. Also known as the Gita Upanishad, the Bhagavad Gita has been the principal handbook for yoga for more than 5,000 years. In contrast to many mundane literatures of the present day, the Bhagavad Gita is free from mental speculation and is complete in knowledge of the eternal self, Atma, the process of Bhakti Yoga, and the nature and identity of the absolute truth, Sri Krishna. As such, the Bhagavad Gita is the single most important book in the world, surpassing all others in wisdom and enlightenment. The first word of Bhagavad Gita is Dharma. Sometimes Dharma is mistaken to mean religion or a particular belief, but it is not so. Dharma means the quintessential duty or knowledge that elevates our consciousness to a direct connection with the absolute truth. This is also known as Sanatana Dharma, the occupational duty of all living beings. The Bhagavad Gita begins with the word Dharma. Thus we can understand from the outset that Bhagavad Gita is not about dogma or a sectarian way of thinking. Indeed, Bhagavad Gita is the complete science of realizing the absolute truth. For an observant person, it is clear that the world around us is a bewildering place with many unsolved mysteries. If one is seeking answers to the age-old question of, who am I? Why do I suffer? Where do we come from? What is the purpose of life? What happens after death? Then one will find great satisfaction in the Bhagavad Gita, because the Gita answers these questions and more with the utmost clarity. As a young seeker of truth, I first came in contact with the Bhagavad Gita in 1968. In subsequent years, I had traveled to India and studied Bhagavad Gita under the foremost gurus of the late 20th century, Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada and Swami Bhakti Rakshak Sridhar Deva Goswami Maharaj. By the goodwill of these two great masters, the essential message of Bhagavad Gita entered my heart, and I was soon to be situated on the path of self-realization. As with any path in life, one will certainly encounter crossroads. The first crossroads that I came to while studying the Bhagavad Gita was to decide on the path, personal or impersonal. Was I to follow the path of personalism, ultimately to perfect the individual self and enter into the spiritual sky of the Vaikuntha planets and live eternally with the Supreme Person, Sri Krishna? Or was I to follow the path of impersonalism, ultimately ending existence as an individual living being and merging myself into the Brahmajyoti of infinite bliss? I chose the former, Bhakti Yoga. Bhagavad Gita is specifically meant for those following the path of Bhakti Yoga. Many impersonal philosophers have tried to lay claim to the Gita over the years, at times even claiming to be Sri Krishna, a claim that is exposed by the simple fact that they do not understand the message of Sri Krishna in Bhagavad Gita, despite its profound clarity. Sri Krishna is the original speaker of Bhagavad Gita. Therefore, he must know the message of the Gita better than anyone. And Krishna says in the 18th chapter that the message of the Gita is exclusively meant for those who are aspiring to know the absolute truth on the path of Bhakti Yoga. Bhagavad Gita is certainly a scholarly work, but one need not be a scholar to understand the Gita's straightforward and simple message. Indeed, Arjuna, the first student of Bhagavad Gita, was not a scholar but a warrior. In the past, many great scholars, gurus, and self-realized masters have written illuminating commentaries to accompany the Gita, its as it is meaning, its poetry, philosophy, and its hidden treasure, so that the people of their time, as well as the people of future generations, may have a better appreciation of the message of Sri Krishna. We have now completed the first decade of the 21st century, and a host of such erudite commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita sit upon the bookshelves and in our libraries. Surely there is no call for yet another. The message of Bhagavad Gita is eternal and unchanging, but the time that surrounds us is always changing. Thus, our perceptions of life, our current situation, and our necessity is always changing. To meet the changing times and the present necessity, yet another commentary is being presented. a brief commentary called the Anuvriti. According to Vishwanath Chakravarti, a renowned commentator on Bhagavad Gita from antiquity, the first 6 chapters of the Gita mainly pertain to karma, the second 6 chapters to bhakti, and the final 6 chapters to jnana. But the answers of life's most puzzling questions are found throughout the 18 chapters of the Gita, with Sri Krishna's last and conclusive instructions to Arjuna in verse 66 of the last chapter. Sarva dharmam parityatya mam ekam saranam vraja. In our Anubriti, we have not commented on each and every verse spoken by Sri Krishna, as we feel that by directly hearing from Krishna with one's intelligence, one receives the greatest knowledge, and further comment is not always necessary. The comments made in the Anubriti are to highlight certain points and to reflect on what Krishna says with relevance to our world today. What lies ahead in our Anubriti are the basics of Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy, Achinta Bheda Veda Tattva, and the essential understanding for the practice of Bhakti Yoga. Many readers may want to delve deeper into the knowledge of the Bhagavad Gita, and for such persons, we highly recommend the study of the 1973 Macmillan edition of Bhagavad Gita, As It Is, by Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Other recommended readings are the commentaries of Vishwanatha Chakravarti, Baladev Vidyabhushan, Bhakti Vinod Thakur, and Swami Bhakti Rakshak Sridhar Deva Goswami. We would like to express our sincere appreciation for those who have encouraged us in our work and helped to bring Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna's illuminations on the perfection of yoga, to completion. May this publication be an offering unto the Absolute Truth Sri Krishna. Krishnarpanam Astu. So that was Swami Bhakti Gaurava Narasingha Maharaj, August 22nd, 2011, on Sri Krishna Janmastami, the appearance day of Sri Krishna Gurubda 526. The history of the Bhagavad Gita. This history was approved by Jagatguru Swami Bhakti Gaurava Narasingha Maharaj. Since time immemorial, the Bhagavad Gita has been a prime source of inspiration for many great thinkers and philosophers in both the East and the West. In ancient times, the first commentary on the Gita was written by Adi Shankar, who was the first Acharya to treat it as a freestanding text. Note here, Acharya means spiritual master or spiritual teacher. Subsequently, other great Acharyas such as Ramanuja, Madhva, Sridhara Swami, and others wrote commentaries on the Gita that presented its essential devotional significance in stark contrast to Adi Shankara's impersonal interpretations. In the Western world, the Bhagavad Gita has been highly appreciated by erudite scholars and philosophers such as Henry David Thoreau, Friedrich Schlegel, Arthur Schopenhauer, Carl Jung, and Hermann Hesse. Upon reading the Gita, the famous American transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson commented, "I owed a magnificent day to the Bhagavad Gita. It was the first of books. It was if an empire spoke to us, nothing small or unworthy, but large, serene, consistent, the voice of an old intelligence which, in another age and climate, had pondered and thus disposed of the same questions which exercise us." End quote. Originally, the Bhagavad Gita is part of the ancient historical epic, the Mahabharata, composed by the great sage Vyasa in approximately 3100 BCE. The 18 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita are found within the 6th canto of the Mahabharata, known as the Bhishma Parva, which altogether contains 117 chapters. Initially, Vyasa wrote the 8,800 core verses of the Mahabharata, and later his disciples, Vaisampayana and Sutta, added further historical details until the Mahabharata finally consisted of 100,000 verses, 7 times the size of Homer's Iliad and 15 times the size of the King James Bible. The word Mahabharata means the history of the greatest India and recounts the story of 2 feuding royal families, the Pandavas, the sons of Pandu, and their cousins, the Kauravas, the sons of Dhritarashtra. Both Pandu and his brother Dhritarashtra belonged to the royal Kuru dynasty of Hastinapura, modern-day Delhi. Although Dhritarashtra was the elder of the two, he was born blind, and so the throne was passed on to Pandu, who became the heir apparent. However, Pandu died untimely, leaving 5 children: Yudhisthira, Arjuna, Bhima, Nakula, and Sahadev. While the Pandavas were still young, their uncle Dhritarashtra assumed the throne as regent until they were of age to rule the kingdom. Yet, due to his excessive parental attachment, Dhritarashtra schemed that his own sons, led by the corrupt Duryodhana, would ascend the imperial throne. To this end, and with the consent of his father, Duryodhana made several assassination attempts upon the lives of the Pandavas. Despite the wise counsel of his grandfather Bhishma, his uncle Vidura, and his military teacher Drona, Duryodhana continued to plot against his cousins. Yet due to the protection of Sri Krishna, the Pandavas were able to foil all his murderous attempts. Historically speaking, Sri Krishna was the nephew of Pandu's wife, Queen Kunti, and was thus the cousin of the Pandavas. However, Krishna was not simply a royal prince, but the Supreme Person himself, who had descended to earth to perform his pastimes and to establish the principles of Dharma. Due to their righteous behavior, Sri Krishna always favored the Pandavas. After numerous failed murder attempts, Duryodhana finally challenged the Pandavas to a rigged game of dice. Duryodhana cheated and won the game, and the Pandavas lost their kingdom. The result was that the Pandavas were forced into exile for 13 years. After completing their 13 years of exile, the Pandavas returned to the capital and requested Duryodhana to return their rightful kingdom. When the proud Duryodhana flatly refused, they requested him to at least give them 5 villages to rule over. At this, Duryodhana curtly remarked that he would not even give them enough land in which to drive a pin. Although the Pandavas sent Sri Krishna as an ambassador to sue for peace, Duryodhana blatantly refused to listen. War was now inevitable. Rulers as far west as Syria and as far east as China came to take part in the battle, some supporting the Kauravas due to their political designs, and others favoring the Pandavas due to their piety. During this fratricidal war, Krishna stated that he would not take up arms for either side, but accepted the position as Arjuna's charioteer. Thus, in the month of December in 3138 BCE, both armies assembled on the plains of the holy place known as Kurukshetra. The significance of Kurukshetra is related in the Vamana Purana that narrates how the virtuous king Kuru, the ancestral patriarch of the Pandavas and Gaurava dynasty, performed rigorous austerities at Kurukshetra. Because of this act, Kuru was given 2 blessings. Firstly, that Kurukshetra would be named after Kuru, and secondly, that anyone who died at Kurukshetra would attain the celestial planets. The Bhagavad Gita is spoken on the first day of the war at Kurukshetra. As the 2 armies prepare to fight, the blind Dhritarashtra sits in his court with his faithful servant Sanjaya and inquires from him as to what the virtuous Pandavas are doing. Sanjaya, a disciple of the great sage Vyasa, had been blessed with the mystic power to observe the conflict far from the battlefield at the palace in Hastinapura. Sanjaya then narrates to the old emperor the sacred conversation between Sri Krishna and Arjuna. Thus, the Bhagavad Gita was received by Sanjaya and repeated to Dhritarashtra for the spiritual benefit of all humanity. And that ends the historical perspective. Now we move on to the Mangalacharanam, auspicious invocation. That will be coming up in the next video. Hari Bol, Srimad Bhagavad Gita Ki Jai.